Hi everyone, we'll just give it a minute for people to come in and then we'll kick the webinar off. So, yeah, so people start to come in now, which is good. Welcome everyone. Looking forward to a great chat with Brad this afternoon. I've got the chat open, so if anyone's got any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. It should be open to everyone. I will actually just test that now, just so that people can see this. So hopefully everyone sees that message. If someone can respond just by saying you've received it, that would be great. I know that it's working. Brilliant. Thank you, Liz. Appreciate that. So, right, I think we will make a start. So thanks everyone for joining us. Really looking forward to a great chat with Brad around getting your board dynamics right and keeping them right. So great boards don't just get the strategy, the structure and the papers right, they also get the behaviours right. And that's what we're going to be talking about. And that's where board dynamics matter. Governance 365, which I'm part of, exists to make that easier. So we help boards see what they can't see on their own, their blind spots, in areas like clarity, challenge, cohesion, decision-making, information flows, risk decisions, role clarity, and psychological safety. Then we support them to focus their improvement efforts where they will matter the most, measurably improving their governance maturity. So I'd love to introduce Professor Brad Jackson, one of New Zealand's most influential governance and leadership thinkers, for a practical conversation about how boards can strengthen and sustain the dynamics that sit underneath performance. So Brad will share some insights around his teaching, his research, his advisory work and board experience, including how to open the black box of boardroom behaviour and move beyond compliance into generally improved outcomes. So we'll explore what boardroom dynamics really are and why now is the moment to focus on them, how to balance that cohesion with robust challenge, why behavioural/relational competence is becoming the next major differentiator in governance, and how evaluations can be used as a genuine driver of growth, not just a tick box exercise. And importantly, this isn't a theoretical webinar. Governance 365 will show how boards can measure their behavioural maturity, see where they're strong or weak, and then prioritise improvement on purpose. So better insight, better decisions, better outcomes. That's our promise at Governance 365. So let's get into it. Thanks, Brad, for joining me.
Kia ora, Jerry. Love what you do with Governance 365, and really pleased I'm here. And I gather this is the last of the webinars for the year, right?
It is, absolutely. So finish with the best. So that's what I say. So we'll start the conversation really about this black box. So when you open the black box of board behaviour, what do you typically discover that boards themselves can't see?
Yeah. Well, 15 years ago when I started researching boards, the black box was an app descriptor. It was basically very hard to get inside. Really difficult to observe boards in action because of confidentiality. And so most of the governance research was actually done by inference. In other words, it was trying to infer what was actually going on by using numbers and analyzing numbers. And I was very fortunate at the University of Auckland. I was part of a group of promoting responsible leadership and governance. And we did manage to get access to some pretty important influential boards like Air New Zealand and the Bank of New Zealand. And they enabled us to talk with each of the board directors, but also observe their governance practices. So it's now what I would describe a grey box. There's a lot more transparency and openness. If you think about this whole notion of creating opportunities for shadow directors and shadow boards, there is a sense that boards are more receptive to opening up. Now, one thing I would assume is that I don't have any X-ray specs, so I can't necessarily see things that that boards might not be able to see. What I would suggest, though, is that the board dynamics have not necessarily been a priority. It's not the norm to think in terms of board dynamics. There's so many issues, so many other things to tackle, that it's a question of sort of saying, actually just inspecting and looking at behaviours by the board. And I guess the thing I'd want to sort of distinguish is the difference between sort of board dynamics, which looks at how the boards not only works within itself around the table, which is what we describe boardroom dynamics, but how it engages as a board with its various stakeholders groups, either as individuals or as boards. So those board behaviours are not just around the table, the board table, but actually their behaviours in the director roles, the chair roles as well. So if you think about it, board dynamics is the overall descriptor. Boardroom dynamics is probably where the rubber hits the road, the crunch, what goes on around the table.
Hey, Brad, could you just move your camera down a little bit so I can
Yeah,
see your
so we'll do.
face? A
Yeah, great. Helpful.
little bit more.
Better.
Yeah, yeah.
Awesome. Great.
So excellent. Next, what you've talked about board dynamics, and now's the moment. So why is it more important now than say 10 years ago?
Well, a lot greater expectations and scrutiny is being placed on board, particularly board performance, not only by shareholders, but employees, customers, regulators, suppliers. And it's real focus on ethical standards and the recognition that actually, if you think of the old phrase, the fish rots from the head, that actually, if you like, it's not a question of what boards focus on, it's how is important, because that has a huge influence on ethical practices and standards throughout the organization. And let's face it, there's a heck of a lot more. The challenges are so much more complex, so much more dynamic. Think about, I think COVID actually was probably the stimulus for actually thinking about how do we do our work as boards. It challenged a lot of the norms and assumptions. So, for example, online board practice became a possibility, but also seen as advantageous. Focus on cybersecurity, AI, etc. So the other thing is this idea that we focus a lot in organizations in creating high performance teams at the frontline level, middle management level, and the senior leadership team. But if we were to think about the board as a high performing team, as an aspiration, what are the things that would come to the surface, the fore, that we'd need to focus on to make sure that these boards are actually performing at a much higher level? Now, thing I will say about boards is they are very distinctive groups. They only meet episodically. They have imperfect information. They have multiple allegiances, and you have, quote, some very strong personalities. Some people who are really, have got a lot of mana, a lot of status as well. But actually, so there are some things that are distinctive, and it is very hard to actually, if you like, measure success, because there are so many measures of success around board, but also the organization. So what I'd say, though, is that there is what's good for the goose is good for the gander. To what extent are boards themselves high performance teams, but recognizing they have very distinctive characteristics?
Okay. And so you talk about groups and teams. Do you call them a team or a group? Because there's a lot of debate about whether they're a team
Yeah.
or.
Well, it is. I mean, if you like, teams are aspirations. I've been part of so many groups that called themselves teams, but in my life, I probably belonged to maybe 5 or 6 teams. So it had a clear sense of purpose, mission, interdependence, and a very, strong commitment to high performance. But it's more of a sense of seeing that as a possibility, of not just a group of people that get around and meet, etc., and listed, but actually, particularly, and I'll be frank with you, Jerry, when I look back on my career, when I think about when I've been part of high performing teams, other than on, quote, the sports field, or, when I've been in teaching, etc., it has been when I've been part of boards dealing with really tough issues, really, make or break issues for the organizations. And I've had that feeling of, wow, that felt very different to my, quote, day-to-day engagement. It's not uniform, but as you know, Jerry, when you've been there, it is something quite special when and the board is never the same once it's created that sense of team where it's gone beyond the individuals. It's really tackled tough. It's been emotionally charged, but actually you've come through and you feel intellectually exhausted, emotionally exhausted, but you come up with the best decision. And so, in a way, that's part of what draws me to boardroom dynamics, is because I see when you're in there, it's rare, but when you're in, it's really, really special, and it's important for the organization's success as well.
What are the things that lead to that? Because I'm quite interested in terms of getting to that. You talk about sense of purpose, interdependence, but having a team that's a high performing team, what leads you towards that? What has to be in place to for that to occur?
Yeah. Well, we can talk about, critical roles like, for example, the chair. The chair can make a massive difference in terms of setting the tone. If you think about the first among equals and setting the tone from the top, it's actually that the chair plays a really vital role there. But one of the key things they're able to do is also to encourage and inspire the rest of the directors around that table to actually aspire to become a team, and actually to lay out the reasons for that, what that would be like, what are the kind of behaviors, etc. But there is something about, but I think it's in those particular moments is when if you like, it's this sense of, okay, uh, are we greater than the sum of our parts?
Mm.
Because much of governance is, it's about who's around the table and all of their individual achievements, etc., and what they bring to the table. We don't focus enough on how well they get synergy. That they actually, when they come together, you get a heck of a lot more than you do from, say, 8 or 9 exceptional individuals. So I do think it really comes from the chair actually setting the tone. I call this building the field of play, and creating the rules and the parameters, but also encouraging and interceding when it's required to actually say, no, that's not acceptable, that's suboptimal behavior. So, but I do think it's the willingness to take on, and this is probably where, uh, you know, when I was at the University of Auckland, we brought together leadership and governance perspectives because they were historically quite separate.
Mm.
Leadership was what took place at the CEO level down, and governance was quite separate from leadership. But if you actually start to say that we need to promote leadership and responsible leadership and governance, you need courage, you need vision, you need mission, you need those things. And what I saw historically, generally is that this notion that the directors do governance, the senior team do leadership, the middle managers do management, and the rest show up. And that's, and as you well know, governance, leadership, management needs to reach through the entire organizations. So really good boards do their bit to make sure that governance is everybody's business.
Yeah. There's a quick one here. Question at some stage, can you address how co-chairs work well? So when you have a co-chair, how
Yeah.
does that link with a high-performing team and high-performing board?
Yeah, and I've seen that work well, and I've seen pretty average things. I think there really has to be a strong rationale. Um, and to be honest, in leadership, everybody will focus on, for example, the CEO, but I'm always very interested in, quote, the CFO and those that are around. So I kind of take a co-leadership or a group leadership view anyway. It's just that I think when there's a really clear mandate and a clear sense of why that combination has to come together. And it could be because of, their expertise, or it could be a representing, two very important different sectors or whatever. But there has to be a fundamental rationale there. Um, but actually, no, I think it's open. But part of what I think just generally is that's co-chaired, but actually it's in the context of a very strong shared leadership perspective. So if it's just a matter of convenience and people just saying, well, I give you half of my commitment, that's not going to work. Or if it's a feeling that they, quote, only want to take half the responsibility, that's not going to work. But there really needs to be a strong, it's not just about what the chairs need and what the directors need, it's what the organization needs. That's why you would structure that. Say it's really important for the organization going forward that we create these co-chairs versus convenience or experimentation or whatever.
Mm.
I want to know the rationale for that going forward. And of course, it depends on the individuals as well. But if there's not an underlying, it's not tied to the strategy or the purpose, it will unravel, I think, just generally.
Yeah, all right. Thank you for that. I want to come back to some of your research and some of the work I've seen from you around your 11 C's model, and you might be able to show this on the screen. So,
Yeah.
just want you to explain the essence of this model and which C boards struggle most with in practice.
Yeah, great. Now, well, look, the model I'm going to show, and I'll bring that up right now. Here we go. Is that showing up, Joe?
Yep, that's showing up.
Yeah, great. So this model we use in a course that I teach for Chartered Governance Institute in New Zealand called Board Dynamics. And this really sort of sets out the kind of multi-dimensional perspective we need to get about governance in order to be able to start to recognize the power of board dynamics. It's been developed by a gentleman called Jeremy Cross for Chartered Governance Institute of the UK and Ireland. And but essentially what it does, it's a very straightforward model, but it makes sure that we are aware of all of these dimensions. We're not just focused on one quadrant or one of the C's too. So the critical thing about this model is that it makes it very simple. It's the old 2 by 2 simple distinction between technical and behavioral. So no, technical is the kind of hard black and white stuff that's out there. Behavior is sort of, much more internally or group focused as well. It's about how do actually people behave despite the structures that have been created there as well. The other dimension is a sort of focus on individuals versus board. And so what you can see here is, in the top, the technical board focus, there is a kind of strong sense of board structure. And the question about, co-chairs is a structural question, but it has strong behavioral implications too as well. But the individual technical is sort of getting a sense of what is the capacity of the individual directors, their capability. What I'd say is generally it's that top end where a lot of the attention gets focused on because it's sort of we can measure that. It's black and white. It can be written down, it can be depicted. Where it gets a little murky, but also, as we know, it's more salient, is when we start to get into the behavioral zone too. So look, what I'll do is I'll just quickly take you through each of those quadrants because it just gives you a little bit more detail. When we talk about board structures, the key question we have is, does the board and the committee have and the constituent committees have appropriate configuration? Are they compliant? So if you think about the various structures, the chairman, the chairperson set up, the tenure of the directors, the board tasks, the committees, those kinds of things, which you'd see well documented in annual reports, for example. Whereas, the board demographics is really about capacity. They've got the right fit. What are the board's external commitments? Do they have the capability, not only in terms of expertise, but also, professional capital as well? And of course, this whole focus on diversity is very much in this particular quadrant. And how connected are they? What are the kind of connections do they open? So these are the sort of 2 quadrants where most of the attention takes place. I'm seeing a lot more attention in annual reports. I've got my MBA students do analysis of annual reports and how boards represent themselves. We're seeing a lot more, not just in board structure, but also more in board dynamics. But what we don't see too much of is in this third quadrant about the attributes. Do the directors display the competence, commitment, and character? And that's something that I think is we're starting to see more, quote, psychometric tests I've done of board members, a more thorough investigation of the individual directors too. But the sweet spot and the area that I suppose I am most animated by, largely because when this works well, it makes a huge difference. We start to get towards a team. All of the other parts are kind of group focus, whereas this is very much in the team focus, and this is in the board dynamics, where we focus on the board cohesion, but also appetite for challenge, its ability to make collective decisions, to converse with stakeholders, and does it really have deep diversity, not just superficial? Is it a diversity of thought, diversity of experience, and diversity of, I guess, worldviews, and that sort of broader board environment. So hopefully you've got a better picture of that. And I'm not, this is not going to surprise you, Jerry, when you ask me about which is the area that where I think that, where we tend to get more problems and more challenges, by the same token, more opportunities. It is definitely in that board dynamics. And I know that, A, because of my own experience, but also experience of all of my MBA students, my self students, and also the CGINZ students, because the stories they tell me of what goes on here, I'm not here to share those, is generally uh, it's rarely exceptional. It's generally pretty ordinary. Less of a focus. Boards really stuck in just kind of the ways they've always done things and not paying attention to this particular quadrant. So,
Sorry,
yeah,
Karen.
is that helpful, Jerry, in terms of kind of laying it all out?
Yeah, it is. And I was going to dive a little bit deeper on that fourth quadrant in terms of what is it that you're not seeing. So is it, a constructive challenge or the decision making? What's the bit that they struggle most, or is it an awareness thing? What's holding them back from sort of
Yeah.
in that area?
Well, what I see in a few boards is that there is this sort of sense that is a sort of high sort of, it's almost like it's quite highly ritualized, the governance practice. So in other words, this is what it's like to do governance, and the agenda, the papers, if you like, the structures drive so much of what gets done. There's sort of this notion of actually saying, you know what, we could do this work differently. You know, it's like, because of all of the issues and all of the things that have to be addressed, it's really about actually saying, hold it, it's, are we really adding value here? Are we really making a difference? Now, that is a tough question to raise because, A, if you just join the board, it's like we've got a rabble riser. We've got, particularly when a professor raises these things, they go, oh my gosh, we'll never get anything done. But there is that, it takes a lot of courage to say, that meeting, I thought we did well here, but actually, I'm not quite sure where we spent so much time there. And when so and so surfaced an opinion, nobody picked up on it. Why was that? What's that about? How are we together? How could we be more real and less focused on ritual? In other words, this is what boards do. It's almost like and a lot of it is, it's very hard for those, but it's also very hard for those that have been there for a while, particularly when the boards, generally seem to be successful, to actually say, hold it, you know what? I think we can do better here. I think there's ways in which we can change the agenda, we can change where we meet, how we meet. The one thing that particularly that the course that I've been teaching on boardroom dynamics is actually geared to those who support boards, so company secretaries, governance professionals, council, or whatever. Because I've emphasized the chair, but actually, what that course is helping them do is to say, you know what, you can play a role here. You can challenge, you can create other possibilities here about how this board might be as well. And that takes a lot of courage because, they're there to just deliver and respond. But actually, what we argue in the course is actually they can play an important leadership role. But generally in New Zealand, we're not looking for that. We don't have designated company secretaries to do that. And yet, if you think about how vital and how important, why aren't we investing in that capacity to support boards to perform at a higher level going forward? So I think it's ritual. I think some people feel that they want to be seen as a team player. They don't want to rock the boat. And to be honest, they have a lot of other things on their plate. And do they really want to dedicate the time and to be able to challenge how things are? And so, I mean, they may talk to some other people after the meeting. They may talk to the chair. I don't know. But generally, people will just say, well, that was great for an hour, but then those other 2 hours, I'm not quite sure what that was about, why we did it that way. So it's
Mm,
really about being willing to ask, what are we doing here? And is this the best use of our time? The
yeah,
simple question.
yeah, no, and I've seen a practice that works very well in boards and leadership teams, which is literally just saying, score this meeting out of 10,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and having a conversation about where you land on that, and everyone has to answer that. Which is around driving accountability. Because if you say, how was the meeting? And they say, yeah, it was good.
Yeah.
doesn't really help you.
But a score is very good. Yeah. We start our meetings in one of my boards with, how are we? Where are we at? It was a score of 10. And then, we could bookend that with, well, what do you reckon in terms of our other meetings, how they could be? What
Yeah,
and why do you score it that way? How would
yeah,
we become an 8? How would we become a 9?
yeah,
That kind of thing. That's a great technique. Yeah.
yeah. That's good. And linked to that is psychological safety. So, is there a piece there around people not willing to speak out or challenge the ritual, or because there's an element of psychological safety at play where they don't feel safe to do that, or they're new and they don't feel they've built up their credibility to do that? So how
Yeah.
would you say psychological safety plays a role in this?
Yeah, because there is this this notion of smart people. It's really hard to get them to learn because
Yeah,
they've been so successful. And who are you to say, you know what, I don't feel safe here? Uh, One thing that there's a great study done called Inside the Black Box. It was published by Neil and Dulowich in 2010. They said, you know, if you flip it the other way around, when board directors feel psychologically safe, they feel they are keen and they're free to ask questions, any questions. They feel that the board has an appetite to make tough descriptions. There's a shared ownership, and personal relationships are harmonious. So it's not, but I guess they know when there's a spirit of candor and openness, and this notion that they understand the difference between a constructive and a destructive challenge, which is important. So, yeah, I think that's important. Again, chair plays a critical role there in terms of what's the behavior they're acknowledging and rewarding, what's the behavior that they are, if you like, uh, discouraging or pointing out when they have to. And so it's really, when the behaviors, or when it is that sense of noticing and saying, really like the fact you stood out there, you made that point, but the way you backed away and let others step up, that's awesome. That made a big difference.
yeah. And just coming on to some of the board misbehaviors you see most often, um, can you sort of say what the top ones are and how they show up, maybe subtly, that are not as obvious maybe as you think? So
Yeah. Well, I mean, this notion of misbehavior is obviously the major focus areas in, major ethical and moral breaches in director behavior. But in a way, it's often the minor unconscious sort of behaviors. So that sort of are the really damaging behaviors, and they're a lot more universal. Um, I think what I've done is I've decided to call them sub behaviors as suboptimal as opposed to miss, because that already, so it's always on a gradation here. So look, just thinking about my own experience, simple things like people jumping in and hijacking the discussion if they have a strong personal view. And sometimes that's wrapped up in a humor that they use to bring others alongside here. And they feel that they're very strong that their most important job here is to speak their mind, and particularly to speak on behalf of others. So they're adding value when they speak, and they dominate the discussion. And the trouble is it sort of it discourages other people to step in, particularly when they feel they're at a sort of divergent perspective there. And, sometimes these lines of inquiry are quite promising, but they get shut down by this sort of strength of the conviction of the argument that's made, particularly when that person will make the same point again if they don't feel they've been properly heard. And I suppose that's the thing. It's this notion of people have a strong sense about what they're there to do. And it is interesting, just generally, the way we think about leadership. It's I'm a leader because I speak my mind. My voice is the loudest. I am most passionate about that. But it completely obviates this collective conversation that we're trying to create, that we're
mm,
trying to learn. But I think people are hardwired to say, "Well, I put it very clearly that I stood my ground in that area. That was my." And I think sometimes it's a mental model about what they think is effective governance. And so by just thinking about, we have a better sense of what good leadership behavior is. So if you apply the same good leadership in governance, then that starts to open up some other possibilities. So it's the small stuff, but it's cumulative. And it's often about swaying people jumping in to support the dominant personality, got the kind of political dimensions here. And we know who these people are. I mean, they're the people that we tend to, put on a pedestal and say they're amazing. They're great spokespeople, but are they great team players? I don't know. That's the question I'd probably raise for everybody here.
Yeah. And a good director, how would they deal with that? So you'd hope the chair calls it, but if the chair
Yeah.
doesn't call it, what would a good,
Yeah.
responsible director do in a situation like that?
Well, you've nailed it right. Because I think we always wait for, quote, the chair to do the right thing, and then they don't. So we'll kind of sit back. But I think it's a question of, it's like anything, when you've got a performance issue, it's the same as the idea is to find the right moment, the right time to talk to the person, to basically, focus on the kind of what I talk about is, what is the particular aspect of their behavior, uh, why that is not necessarily helping the board perform at its highest level. And really, it's really about, quote, the behavior, not the person. Tone is everything in these things, but it's actually acknowledging, really appreciate your passion, what you're bringing to the table here as well. But have you thought next time maybe this could be a way to approach that? And that takes a lot of guts. But
Mm.
also, I think in the context of when you've got harmonious relations, just a quiet word, but a very focused word in the right spirit. And I suppose it's why I'm so passionate about boards taking a collective leadership approach, not getting hung up on, well, that's the chair's business or the CEO's, or, that it's actually, we have to take ownership of this as well, And
Yeah.
but it always starts with the mirror, Jerry. It always starts with I got to look first and they just say, really appreciate what you're trying to achieve there. I get that. I'm just wondering if it might you might achieve something like this way in future.
Yeah. I've seen a good model used in this area around coaching, which is SBI,
Yeah.
which is the situation was this morning in the board meeting,
Yes.
I saw the behavior, I saw you talk over or you continually talk. The impact was on you shut down the person. I saw them withdraw. What was your intention in that situation?
Yeah.
Asked, following up with a question. So I think that model is quite good in terms of because it's non-confrontational. It's just trying to explore their point of view and what they were trying to achieve.
Yeah. And, we have those moments over tea and biscuits or whatever it is that we've got, where we can sort of float that and say, and so I guess what I'm saying is the basic ideas of giving feedback to people apply just as much in the governance realm as they do in the leadership or in the management realm. You know what I mean? But we have this sense of it's different because it's board directors. But it's actually, if we say, okay, there's different stakes, there are different personalities here as well. But those same things that you would apply in any team that you're part of, why don't you apply them in
Yeah,
around the board table? I suppose that's what, because there is this sense there's something quite distinctive and special about, quote, the boardroom table, and which still doesn't allow, for, quote, suboptimal behavior.
yeah. Got a couple of questions here. I'll just write. This is interesting. What about members forming informal subgroups, gossip groups, e.g., staging a coup or stroke no confidence in?
Yeah. When good boards go bad, yeah. Well, I mean, that's really, again, it's actually a question of who you are around that table and actually being willing to keep your independence, but also to promote interdependence. But yeah, the whole factionalism, the whole politics, that's going nowhere. But it's amazing how and I guess this notion of boardroom, it's often the stuff that goes on well outside of the boardroom that is generally having the kind of negative deleterious effect here. But yeah, people will line up. That's the way, particularly when the stakes are really high. But I think the chair can play a critical role in actually calling that, laying that out. But again, it's everybody's responsibility because it's kind of interesting. You've got to maintain your individual independence, but you've also got to be willing to be interdependent. And this is a halfway house. You're just lining up, creating factions. And it's that sense of is that the kind of behavior that you want to see routinely practiced throughout the organization? Is
Mm.
that is that kind of how you want things to be done, at the senior leadership team level? No way, you wouldn't put up with that as a director. And you certainly wouldn't put up with it, in terms of, frontline employees or your suppliers or whatever. So why does it work? Why is it okay around the boardroom table? You know?
Yeah.
So
Yes. What you're saying is, if you've got someone to say to the chair, say it to the chair, give them the feedback, and don't try and sort of, because it's been dishonest not actually giving that feedback or not feeling you can give that feedback
yeah.
directly.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, when I first arrived in New Zealand back in 1999, I was given a couple of pieces of advice, but the one I remember was don't, if people aren't quote giving you, not complaining about you or giving you negative feedback, don't assume that essentially you're doing fine because they're
Yeah,
telling five other people. And so really it's about how do we move out of that passive aggressive to actually create the environment where people say what they think. That you can quote head off that faction building. You
yeah,
can encourage, sometimes quite emotive behavior. Let's get it out. Let's address it versus, in the bar afterwards or on the plane, the choral club or whatever it might take place. Let's get it out on the table. And sometimes, it's that again that notion that everything should be calm, should be, well ordered, ritualized. That was a good meeting. Everything sort of went down. We got through everything. That was great. But actually, sometimes you've got to get stuff out. People have got to be real in that context, not ritualized, which is
yeah.
often what I see.
And
Um,
there's a link to a question really around what separates a board evaluation that genuinely catalyzes improvement versus one that is just compliance.
yeah, and of course, these are becoming a lot more widespread, Jerry. I mean, they're becoming, mandated in the profit and the for purpose sector too. Well, I've just been through a board evaluation myself, and what I think is working for us, and it's still in process, is that we all own this. It wasn't, one or two of us saying, let's go out and do this. It was we all owned it. Everybody contributed too. But the critical thing is what's the quality of the conversations we're having about the feedback that we collected? We're getting good, clear conversations, clarifying some things. And have we got some immediate short-term actions that we're moving on? And what are those quote medium and long-term actions? But if it's like any review, unless it has the robust conversation it needs, clarifying conversation, and there's not a commitment to action. It doesn't have to be revolution. Generally, evolution is probably the way to go. Occasional revolution is required. But so right from the start, it's board commitment, but actually all that matters is what's different as a result of that review
Yeah,
and how often. And I think the other thing is the feedback needs to be integrated into the daily practice. It's not like, okay, here's the review stuff. It's like, how does that find its way into, how we are? What are we doing? How do we make that feedback and our actions normal as opposed to, oh, you remember the board review, we got it, and let's get back to normal. So that I think is, um, but I also think the boardroom dynamics, I think people will generally feel comfortable, going back to that 11 C's, people will sort of focus on that quadrant on board structures because that's the easy bit. That's the bit that's got the attention. They may do something around the demographics and maybe a little bit on the attributes, maybe some professional development, but they generally don't want to get into that board dynamics because
yeah.
that's personal. That's emotional. That's hard. You know.
Okay. Next question I've got here is thoughts on the use of board charters. Are they useful? What makes them effective or ineffective?
Yeah, that's interesting. But this is not going to surprise the person because what actually is said on the charter, I'm going to commit heresy by saying this because my legal colleagues, I'm sure, will jump up and down. But it's the process by which that is created is really important. If people feel that, hey, it's been important that they've got involved. They can see they've been heard, and not only just around the board, but the key stakeholders too. So, if people can create they can see themselves in that charter, and it matters. The actual wording, the framing, the formatting, I don't think that matters that much. I mean, and everyone tends to want to go for simple, on a page, and that's fine too. But it's like any of these things. It's the quality of the conversation that people had to get to that, and also the willingness to actually make that a living, breathing document. I think it's written. So don't get me wrong, it does matter what's in there, but I'm going to naturally, because that's just the way I'm wired, is to say how it is created, who's involved, the quality of the discussion, not necessarily the quantity, but the quality of the is, and making that thing stick is really, really important going forward. So when you do get to a point where you think, hang on, let's just go back to that charter. It's a bit like going back to your mission. It becomes a living, breathing, working document. So that's kind of I'm just giving you a different view on that. I wouldn't say there's any. It's got to mean something to
Yeah.
people throughout the organization, and they've got
Yeah.
to see themselves in it.
Yeah. And the last couple of questions I've got is what's the new emerging dynamic trends you seeing, e.g., AI, ESG, stakeholder complexity, that are coming in and affecting board dynamics?
Well, everything and a bit more besides, Jerry. And you've done a brilliant job with your program highlighting, cybersecurity, AI, ESG, backlash, global, geopolitics. So it's a huge bunch of what I call outside in stuff. And consultants and commentators do a brilliant job on that outside in. What I have seen, which has been really interesting, is what I call inside out. So, in other words, boards starting to pay attention to, quote, their board dynamics, their boardroom dynamics, actually start saying, who are we? What do we stand for? What really matters to the organization? Uh, what are the things that are really, really important, and how are we going to be as a team going forward? So it's kind of interesting because there's a sense that we must get out to all these issues. We must have a stance on, paper and all these kinds of stuff. But I'm actually coming across quite a lot of, and I think it's just that part of that digital. Oh, we're digitally overwhelmed, and actually getting back to quote what I call an analog experience of actually saying, who are, what are we about here? So we need to act on the world, not just have the world act on us. A lot
Yeah.
of the world. And so I've actually been, quite encouraged when I talk to various directors about this notion of boardroom dynamics. I could think they might say, "Oh my gosh, this is another thing we've got to add on to the agenda," and we'll have some position paper on this and blah 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 or whatever. But actually, they've actually said, I know what you mean. I've seen that. I've wondered about that, and particularly the liabilities, the expectations, the uncertainties. So, you are quote as a unit, you've got to come together. You've got to find a way to, and so some sense of who you are as a board, what you stand for. I actually think has really become paramount, and people are quite willing to talk about it and be open to it. Yeah. So, ironically, I've given you something that you probably weren't expecting, but of course, I would say that given my investment in boardroom dynamics. But yeah, because it is quite discombobulating. All of the issues and possibilities and opportunities and threats and risks, all this kind of stuff. That we're only human. We've only got this much time now. How do we make that the best time and the best thinking, conversations going forward and best decisions? How,
Yeah.
how do we lift
I
our
think,
game?
yeah, and I think you're right. If you have a high performing team and they are performing, but you're gonna create capacity to make better decisions.
Yeah,
And produce better decisions. So
yeah, but also be more resilient and be
yeah,
more realistic about what you can achieve and what you can't achieve, and where you really, because this whole mantra of the IOD, where are you adding value?
yeah,
What's the best value, and having a clear sense of what that is, and being able
yeah,
to communicate that to all of your constituencies is really, really important.
yeah,
So it is fundamental in this technology world. I think sometimes there's what I call soft technology, just relationships working together is actually at a premium in this day and age. And it's sort of, I suppose it's sort of, thinking about going ahead where I want to focus my efforts is helping coach boards to to really improve their boardroom dynamics, to be at that high performing level, whatever's thrown at them, you know.
Yeah. And I'll finish on the last question. So if a board wanted one practical behavioural shift by next month, what would you recommend they start with?
Yeah, well, it always starts at home. And so I think a sort of a critical sense of where am I in the boardroom dynamics? I know I have a pretty good sense about who I am and what I stand for, etc. But what's the one or two things I will do differently next time we meet, either in preparation or actually in the meeting, that I think can help lift and start to create a high performing team. What am I, what's my contribution here? And particularly to say, normally I would do this, and then I would say this, and then so and so would say this, and then I would say this. Is actually saying, no, surprise yourself and surprise others around that table. So be willing to experiment for the right reasons. But also to ask that question, just as you said at the end of the, what's your score out of 10 on this? I'll be frank, I thought when we were doing this part, that was great because this happened, that happened, etc. I felt we missed an opportunity here. Would have been good if we'd had more time or if we'd actually delayed this and had better information. I think we spent far too much time on that particular area because of this. But encouraging people to say these things, but by willing, talk to the chair by all means, but step up and make that. So experiment and give voice, ask questions about it. That's probably real simple, practical, I hope.
That's good.
Nothing like a good question in this day and age.
That's brilliant. Well, thanks, Brad, for your insights into the black box of boardroom behaviour. It was really invaluable. I think the things I took out really of thinking about the board as a high performing team and sort of debate about is it a team or a group. And I agree with you. It's a team. It should have a shared purpose.
Yeah.
It should be people working to get more of the sum of the parts than the individuals sitting around the room. And the same behaviours. So, what are those behaviours you want around the room? How do you create that psychological safety, trust between people? I think I like that 11 C's model, and we'll hopefully share that with your permission if we can.
Yeah. Well, it's through the Child Governance Institute UK, but I'm sure they'd be delighted to make that public product.
And I think just having that conversation around the group as to what is it we can improve, and just something simple like where are we out of 10, so that people actually take a position.
Yeah, but being willing to explain what the score was.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And you talked about their suboptimal behaviours or sub behaviours, people jumping in and having probably coming from their personal view as opposed from maybe a curiosity point of view, and actually being able to sort of talk to that person in the right format about that. I think board evaluations, actually everyone owning it, you talked about, and maybe the quality of the conversation as a result of that, not just a tick box exercise. The inside out I brought, and again, it comes from the same point of boards starting to pay attention to themselves and how they work together as a group. And then we talked about that one thing is just look in the mirror and what can you do to start this journey. So fantastic conversation, Brad.
Pleasure.
So really to strengthen cohesiveness, the constructiveness, the constructive challenge around the board. And, as I said before, Governance 365 can help in that in terms of we help, unleash some of those or unpack some of those blind spots to start the conversation, because I think what we do is really prepare you to have a better conversation going forward. So if you'd like to know more about that, then get in touch with me. But thank you, Brad. Thanks everyone for joining us, and we will let you know in the near future who we've got on in the new year.
And just one closing thought: good governance is everybody's business. So, yeah, that's
excellent.
May the force be with you.
Excellent. Thanks, everyone. Look forward to and have a great run into the end of the year.
Great stuff. Thanks a lot, Joe.
See ya. Bye.